Hi there. Hello. My name is Miss Amber, and I'm here to do the English 12A live lesson for today. There's a lot to cover today because today's lesson is on Beowulf. So I'm going to get started, and hopefully we'll be able to get very far in the lesson today. Okay, so here we go. This is the list of the tutorials for the classes for 12A. I'm just going to open up the tutorial for Beowulf, and then we're going to get started. So pretty much what this lesson does is gives you the description and background of things that are in Beowulf, the lesson, and just give you some information about how Old English and history contributes to the work. Last time, we went over the history of the English language, which was like also really long and drawn out. And part of the reason why we went over that is because it's very important for you to understand the background behind when Beowulf was written. Beowulf was written during that time when the Anglos, Saxons, the Jutes, and other groups were in Britain. So this was kind of right before Old English was the dominant version of English in the country. So I'm going to skip over to slide 5 where the lesson begins. Okay, so just some quick facts. They give you the historical context of Beowulf, and this is going to be the bulk of the information that you get in this lesson. So they start off with telling you that we don't know the name of the author who wrote Beowulf, but we think that a Christian poet wrote it in the 8th century. That's what it says right here, especially because it was written in Mercian, which was a dialect that was spoken in the middle section of England. If you're having a hard time visualizing that, like the middle section of England, I would suggest that you go back to the last lesson and look at some of the maps that were on there. If you want a shortcut to the different groups that took over England at different periods of time, you can look in that first lesson as well. And there's also a video that is directly linked in the English resource course, so you can go straight to it. I'm going to go ahead and open this up. Remember that this is in your English resource course. And if you are a Step Up student, you can email us to get that information to you at english@atsedu.net, or you can ask your mentor. If we skip over to English 11A, we get the history of the English language. That is a concept summary. That'll give you like a text summary. And down here we have the video, and the video gives you more detail about the groups that took over England at the time. So if you need a refresher, you can hit this up. You can go back to the last lesson. Either one will work. So basically, this was written in the 8th century. So the 8th century means the 1700s. Remember, the trick for remembering centuries and how they work is you subtract 1 and add 2 zeros to the end of the number. So 8th century, subtract 1, that would be 7, and then add 2 zeros, that's the 700s. So basically, scribes rewrote this in the 10th century. And they rewrote it in the West Saxon dialect. So if that sounds familiar, that's because Old English ended up being mostly a combination of the languages that were thrown together, spoken by the Angles and the Saxons, who were the biggest groups in England at the time. So Anglo-Saxon comes from that. So this is the West Saxon dialect, and they tell you it comes from Southwest England. Many scholars also think that storytellers passed on Beowulf as an oral tradition before the poet wrote the epic. So the reason why it's important to tell you that is because some of the ways that the writing is done is to try to basically put down something that was passed from person to person through speeches. So, like in movies, sometimes when people gather around a campfire and tell stories, that's how people used to pass down stories back in the day, before people were writing a whole lot and way before the printing press was made. So what is Beowulf about? It's a historical account of Germanic tribes, as it says here in this second paragraph here. It's supposed to be a story about a famous warrior that was part of the Danes. And basically, the main tribes in the poem are the Danes and the Geats, which were like a brother tribe in the area at the time. Even though the story originated in the first half of the 8th century, it takes place in the middle of the 5th century. So basically, people wrote this story about how things happened in the past, almost like a mythology to explain the story of a famous person, in this case, a famous warrior, and how that went down. So it says in 1731, a fire heavily damaged the only surviving text of Beowulf. The only surviving text. So we only have one version of the Beowulf story, and a fire damaged it. We don't have any other copies. There's none buried anywhere. This was just the last one that survived. You have to remember paper is very delicate. So if people wrote this down, like while people were traveling and fighting, migrating, crossing waters and stuff, it's very easy for things to get written down to be damaged. And that's kind of why people used to do things orally and tell stories. But the reason why they're telling you this in the lesson is because when you get to the excerpt, you're going to see that there are a lot of lines that have ellipses. Ellipses are those 3 dots that you see. There's a fancy name for that. It's called ellipses. So when you see those 3 dots in Beowulf while you're reading, it means that there was a section of the text in that area or that part of the story that's just missing. And we don't know how to fill it in. There's no way to fill it in. There's only one version of Beowulf that we have access to. We haven't been able to find any others anywhere. So if it's gone, it's gone. We don't know what goes in that blank. And they'll add the ellipses to let you know that either something was taken out because it wasn't completely understandable, or the text is missing altogether. So we don't know anything about what's supposed to go there. Alrighty. So then we get into the characteristics of Beowulf. So characteristics basically are like the traits. So when you describe the characteristics of a person, you're describing what they're like. We're describing what Beowulf is like as a reading piece, right? So they're going to give you a list of stuff that was common at the time for written epics, which is the type of work that Beowulf is. We're going to get into the definition of that. And then they're going to go into the different types of writing tropes, the different types of writing styles, and things that you can find in there. They're basically giving you all this information to prep because they know that Beowulf is a little hard to read. And if you go in with all this information, you have a better idea of how and why it was written the way it was. So we start off with the epic characteristics. So they're going to tell you about what an epic is. And it's basically a long narrative poem that deals with a hero or a hero's exploits. So think of, Hercules and things like that. Whenever you have mythologies that focus on just one person and what they did in their life, that's basically what the foundation of an epic is. If the person is a hero and they went on adventures and they had to defeat a bunch of monsters and do kind of like really big things, that's basically what an epic is. The only thing that sets it apart from a story in that way is that an epic is a type of poem. Part of the reason why it's a type of poem is because it's oral. So basically they had to make stories entertaining to talk to people about on long travels, around the campfire, when people wanted to be entertained anyway. So that's why it's a poem. It's written to be performed by a person. And they did write it down, but it was meant to be performed. So they start giving you information about Beowulf specifically as a text. Beowulf starts in media res, or in the beginning of things, just as the hero departs from his home. So he's from Geatland and he sails to Denmark. So he's part of the Geats and he ends up going to meet the Danes, basically. Danes equals Denmark, Geats, Geatland. He experiences initiation, and initiation here relates to this paragraph up here. So an epic poem is written into three parts. Departure, that's when you leave from home. Initiation, when you basically, initiation is when you become a hero officially. And return, when you come back. And they make up the hero's journey. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's still a pattern that we use in stories today. Whenever you're reading a really big adventure, you usually end up with a hero. He doesn't know his potential. He has to leave to train. He has to leave his family behind, his loved ones and stuff. He has to prove himself through battle to prove that he's learned everything that he's been, training to learn all, while he's away from home. And then he comes back and he's either, he's triumphant. They can see that he's fully a realized hero now, that kind of thing. So even superheroes use that sort of logic. Sometimes even in just coming of age films, you'll see someone gets separated from home. They end up in a different realm. They end up in a different world. They have to become a hero and then they come back. That's all part of the hero's journey. And it's a really, really, really old way of telling stories. As you can see, this is from the 8th century. So Beowulf opens in the middle of things. So he already knows that he has to prove himself and everything by the time the story starts. He leaves Geatland and sails to Denmark. He experiences initiation through battle with monsters. And he returns home after his heroic adventure, but faces another trial. Now, the important thing to note here is monsters, right? So even though this is supposed to be a historical account of German tribes, at the time, adding these kind of supernatural elements was common. You want your hero to seem really big, really buff, very powerful. And so they wrote all of these exaggerated accounts, the same way that like the Greeks wrote about the gods doing crazy stuff to create the world, the same way that religions in general and mythology in general writes about magic and stuff like that involved in how the world is made or how things happen in terms of the seasons and stuff. It's pretty much the same. Now, epic poems usually have a theme of good versus evil. Epics are almost entirely about heroes and what they do. So obviously, whoever they're fighting would be considered evil. The hero is usually whatever the culture of those people at the time think is the best quality of the people that are living there. So everything that they want their average person to look up to and aspire to, that those are the traits that they give their characters in these stories. So Beowulf is brave, he's loyal, and an excellent fighter. And he's true to his word, both as a warrior and later as a king. And these were the things that were considered important to people at the time. So they get emphasized in the story. It's the same as when you read, like a story that your friend wrote and they write about, like a cool main character who has all these powers and things. People like to choose what they think is the best. It's no different even back then. So at the bottom of this slide, they talk about the elevated style of writing. So basically, they make it very, very clear that Beowulf, the main character, the hero, he is the best human that has existed. He basically gets written about always in a good way. It's elevated, an elevated style of writing. So they use big fancy words to describe Beowulf to emphasize that he's the best. There's nothing better than him. And that's supposed to make the story seem more important. So remember that the style of writing is how someone writes. So we don't really think that people in the 8th century spoke in that elevated tone, always praising the best person who was around at the time, but it's just the way the story is written. So they want you to remember that people back in the 8th century weren't like Beowulf on average. This is just a story that's supposed to celebrate who they thought was the best. He's basically the like Superman of the 8th century. So they put all the things that they thought were best about themselves into this character and then wrote about what he did. So here we get a little more characteristics of epics, not just Beowulf. So we talk about hubris or arrogant pride. The last time that this came up in a lesson, I think, was in 11A or B, when they talk about the different types of plays like Greek tragedies and stuff like that. So hubris is arrogant pride. It's not only when you have pride in yourself, it's when you are arrogant about it. You're boasting, you think you're better than everyone. You're not willing to consider the honor of the person that you're fighting. And that ends up being the hero's downfall in Beowulf, because it wasn't just important that a person be strong and powerful. They also had to have the moral and ethical look of what people wanted at the time. So down here in this last paragraph, they kind of go over this. One final way in which the author places emphasis on the hero and the plot is by extreme attention to detail. And this includes describing weapons in great detail. It was believed that the success of a weapon was directly related to the skill that it was crafted. So if it was made out of something super powerful, then it was considered great. And in a similar way, if the hero fought with honor, then they were expected to win. That was just what people believed at this time. Hubris is the downfall of Beowulf because arrogant pride is not something that you are supposed to be as a person. So these stories reflected basically, here are the ways we want people to be. Here are the ways we don't want people to be. If you're like this, you're going to fail, just like Beowulf when he got too big for his britches, was too prideful, and was boasting. So that's important. And then here in this middle paragraph, they go over the supernatural elements of the story that I mentioned earlier. So epics usually have magic, monsters, and superhuman qualities. We're supposed to believe that Beowulf is the best human that exists, but he can do other things that humans could never do, like breathing for days underwater. Being just unusually brave. Like normally, if you're fighting a monster, you have to fight against the human instinct to like run or hide or something like that. Beowulf doesn't have any issues with that. And he's able to deal with those supernatural threats, monsters, dragons, and stuff without any issues, even though humans normally couldn't, because they wanted people to believe that if you were great in your morals like Beowulf, it was possible to be as strong as him. The point was to be inspiring and to push what they wanted people to be like at the time. Okay, so they talk about other characteristics here. Basically, they talk about different types of literary devices, the literary devices. So if you recall, literary devices are special techniques that people use in writing. So they talk about alliteration. Alliteration is when you repeat consonant letters in the beginning of words in a line. So here, off skilled the skeefing from squandered foes. So there's an S sound that's repeating. And you have to remember this was supposed to be a performance. So it's said like this and written like this because there's a flow. It's poetic. Remember that even though it's a story, it's also poetry. They also talk about the different words that are used and their sounds to match the subject of the narration. So they give you this example. Cacophonous words, so that's noisy words with like hard sounds, suit the harshness of battle. So they use words with hard sounds when describing battle because when you're listening to it, the sound in your ears, it sounds like it fits. To Beowulf over them, both of them gave the refuge of in wings to right and power. So hard sounds that are made by T, P, F, and G sounds make the line jarring to hear. It's a little hard to even say this out loud because of the flow. So the idea of it is that battle is loud, it's hard to concentrate. So they use the words they picked, like function and form. So the form of the words is supposed to help you immerse yourself in the story, to like feel the story happening around you. Because they didn't have, like fancy movies or like art in the same way back then that you could just look at it any time. So they had to make the words help you feel the reality of what was happening. Okay, so then they also talk about caesura and enjambment. So just as a reminder, caesura is when a break in the line, like at the end of the line, matches the break that's in the actual poem. Let's see. Yep. In fact, punctuation marks such as a comma, period, or semicolon occur in the middle of the line and indicate the need to pause at that point. So such a mark is called a caesura. So you're supposed to notice these breaks on the second and third lines. They're laid down with their darling lord on the breast of the boat, the breaker of rings, by the mast and mighty one, many a treasure. So remember, when you're reading poetry, even though they've broken the lines up, it's important to scan ahead and read everything that's a part of one sentence as it is just as a sentence. The reason why things are broken up in poetry is to make your eyes be drawn to the important words in the poem. When you read it, it's still supposed to read like a single sentence. So if there's a comma in the middle of a line, that's how you know you're definitely supposed to pause. You don't always pause at the end of a line. Here you do, because there is actually a comma. But this line, for example, darling lord on the breast of the boat, this flows seamlessly into this second line. There's no punctuation there to tell you to stop. And then at the bottom, we talk about enjambment. So enjambment is when you want one thought to flow into another without a pause by breaking it up. So this is the part where you actually choose to break up a line in a poem. When you go to the next line without finishing the sentence, that's enjambment. So here we have, so lived the clansmen in cheer and revel a winsome life, till one began to fashion evils that field of hell. This is all one single sentence, but they wanted emphasis on these ideas. The clansmen living in cheer and reveling a winsome life till one began. They're separating these ideas by breaking the sentence up into lines. So you actually have to pay attention to each line instead of just sort of glossing over it. And that's why people break up lines in poems, to break up the ideas that are being expressed in each sentence. So just to go over what's here, an enjambed line does not have punctuation at the end and may not be grammatically, it may be grammatically incomplete. So they're saying, you know, when you make the intentional choice on purpose to break up a line that's not a complete sentence and let the rest of the sentence flow into a second, third, or fourth line, depending on the poem, that's enjambment. Okay, so then we get into some of the older types of literary devices. So I know you've heard of alliteration, enjambment, and all that stuff before, especially if you've taken classes with us in the past. You can actually look at the English concept summaries, and there are places in I know for sure the 9th and 10th grade classes that go over alliteration, enjambment, and poetry, blank verse, and all of those things. But these are actually new. These devices you're about to hear about. These are ones that especially come up in old works like Beowulf. So you haven't heard of them yet. So let's go through them. There's 4 of them. There's kennings. There's epithets. Epithets might have come up maybe once or twice before. There's litotes and synecdoche. So kennings are compound words that act as metaphors for things that people have heard of. So for example, they give you at the top, they uses whale road for the sea. So obviously whales swim in the water. So technically, if you refer to the water as a whale road, it's not wrong, but it's not how we would normally refer to the sea or the ocean. The other example they give you is war dress. It's armor. We know what armor is. We refer to armor all the time, especially in games and movies. But war dress is just a nice metaphor for it. It is what you dress in for war. So it's technically not wrong. So kennings are just very creative ways to refer to things that people have already heard of. And then the last example they give you is earth dwellers for people. It's such a roundabout way to refer to them. But if you want fancy language for a poem, that's the best way to go about it. It's considered to elevate the tone. Like war dress sounds much more fancy than armor, because when you hear something every day, it becomes you get used to it. It's not special anymore. So kennings are a good way to sort of like spice up your writing. The next one is epithet. So an epithet is a quality or characteristic of a person or thing. That's it. So like the most famous epithet that most people talk about is psychopomp. They refer to Hermes as the psychopomp. And it's just a title, like a characteristic that's turned into a title. So the example they give you from Beowulf here is the ring-stemmed vessel, bark of the atheling, lay there at anchor. So here, the epithet is ring-stemmed. It's a characteristic of the ship. So instead of calling it a ship, they call it a ring-stemmed vessel. The difference between a kenning and an epithet is that one, you need a compound word for a kenning. Compound word means that there's two words, two or more words, right? But also an epithet describes a characteristic. So it's not just another name for something. You're describing something about the thing. So for ring-stemmed vessel, what we're learning here is that the ship is the vessel, but it is a ring-stemmed vessel. So there are rings on the masts and other outreaching areas of the ship. The next one is litotes. So a litote is an understatement that employs a negative with the opposite of meaning. So you're using a negative way to describe something and saying, oh, well, it's not this negative thing. So the example that they give you here is that's not good when a catastrophe occurs. Like if a building is on fire and you say that's not good, no. We know it's terrible, but you're saying it's not this good thing. That's what they mean by employ a negative. So if you were to meet a short person for the first time, and what you say is, wow, you're not tall. You didn't have to say you're not tall. Like it's when you say you're not tall, what people are going to think of is, oh, maybe this person's just a little shorter than tall. It's average. But if you're describing a short person, it becomes an understatement. So another example, what they give you from Beowulf is an edge not dull. So dull is when something is not sharp. But when they say an edge not dull, they're negating the dullness. So they're telling you that it's sharp because it is not dull. That's what a litote is. You're saying, to describe something, you're saying it's not this thing. To describe it as the opposite. And it's considered a literary technique because you're going out of your way to describe it that way. If it's raining, pouring cats and dogs outside, and you look up and say, well, that's not sunny, that's a litote. You had to go out of your way to describe it like that because you're trying to be like funny or sarcastic. And that's what the litote is. You're doing it on purpose. And the last one here is synecdoche. A synecdoche uses referencing a part of something to refer to the whole thing. So they give you an example from Beowulf that you're going to read later. They use the word keel to refer to a ship. A keel is a part of a ship. It's the center of the ship. Basically, that large platform on the surface that like the offices, the decks and stuff are built on, that large section in the middle. That's what a keel is, but it's not the whole ship. But if they refer to the keel to reference the ship, you're using a part to describe the whole thing, and that's what synecdoche is. So say you're referring to a computer in a poem. If you just want to call it a fancy chip, there are lots of different types of chips in a computer, but a computer is more than a chip. But if you're trying to be fancy with your wording and refer to it in a way that's like not normal to draw attention to it, you can refer to the computer as a chip. And everyone knows that that's what you're referring to because computers have chips in them. But obviously that's not what a computer is. A computer is not just a chip. So that's what synecdoche is. Whew, we're running a little bit behind already. But I want to get through at least this last slide because it's going to give us information about other stuff that's in Beowulf. So we're going to look at these additional characteristics. So just going down this list in order. The first one is that this is a bro story. There's no romance in this. Beowulf is a hero who is kicking butt, taking names, fighting dragons, fighting monsters. They don't care about romance in this story. You're not going to find Beowulf being set up with some princess or somebody's daughter or something like that. This is a story about warriors being bros, going off to battle and being successful. That's it. The author of Beowulf uses foreshadowing. So basically, you're going to find a lot of hints that refer to, oh, Beowulf's going to be triumphant. Little did he know this would be his greatest adventure yet. Or towards the end, Beowulf doesn't know that this attitude he has is going to be his downfall. So the story is going to talk about itself and things that will happen later in the story. And the reason why they do this in Beowulf is because the author believed in fate. Fate was a big thing back then. So it doesn't really matter if you know the end of the story. You're supposed to enjoy seeing how you get there. You also have to remember that this is, again, an oral story. So this was told out loud. This was a story that people memorized, that lots of people knew. So usually when someone was telling this story, the goal wasn't to tell a new story or add or subtract or anything to it. One, we all know fate guides the characters' lives. No matter how many times this story is told, the ending's going to be the same. So the story grew to include that. But also on top of it, everyone's heard the story before because it's said over and over out loud. So the story just doesn't have any problem telling you, well, we all know this is what's going to happen, but we're going to tell it in a way that's exciting so you won't mind hearing it over and over again. The next one is just some themes that talk about the importance of lineage and family ties. So this is called kinship in the story, but it was a really big cultural thing at the time, to be loyal to your family and to be loyal to your lord if you were a thane. So basically a thane is a warrior. They explain it over here, thanes or warriors. And a thane was bound to defend the lord at any cost. So the sort of thing that you kind of think about when you think about like King Arthur and like the knights, they had a similar thing here, but it was a little different because this is an older kind of version of it. But you were expected to defend your lord at any cost. And then the story implies an adherence to a warrior code. So basically they reference him being loyal to a warrior code in the story, but they don't outline it. And part of the reason why they didn't outline it is because at the time that this story was told, everyone knew about it already. So they didn't have to write it into the story. Back then, people didn't write for people in the future to hear about stuff. They wrote things down to sort of reinforce culture to people who were already there. Okay, one last thing here is the characters. That's the last thing I want to cover today before we go. The rest of the story is going to just give you more, or the rest of the tutorial is just going to give you information about the excerpts and explain and break down some things from the excerpt. But the last thing here is characters. Pretty much, there are characters from different tribes here, because you have to remember there are different groups. There were different groups that worked together or didn't know about each other or came in contact to each other then. So here we get Geats, Danes, Wolflings, Swedes, Jutes, and Frisians. So here, basically, these are just the groups of people that existed at that time that these people knew about and that they interacted with. So it's just important to know that these people were in related territories at the time. There's a lot of characters in this story. We're not expecting you to remember them all. And it's usually confusing for people. So they give you family trees for the Danes in terms of just, you know, this is an epic warrior, and they give you some of the other descendants here. And then siblings that broke off. So that you don't have to memorize these, but when you see a name and you're not sure how they're related, basically you can refer to these to figure out like how people are related. You'll see a lot of my brother, my cousin, kin, and stuff like that. So these two things just give you the family tree so you can actually look and search for the names. So try not to flip out if you can't remember everyone's name, but it might help to have these two things, like up so you can search for a name real quick and figure out how they're related to Beowulf if they are. Okay, that is about it for this lesson. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. The rest of the lesson is pretty much covering Beowulf. Here, slide 18, I'll click over to this just real quick. They give you a shorthand list of telling you who the main characters and main Danes are since Beowulf is traveling to Denmark. And then they give you other geats. So this is just a shortcut, but they don't give you everyone here. They just give you the people that show up most often. So if you're still having trouble with a name that's not on this list, you can go back to slide 17 and look at these family trees. Yep. The rest of the lesson goes over the plot in more detail. Everything that I covered so far was just background information for how Beowulf was written and why it was written that way. The actual story is going to be in the excerpt that they give you on slide 17. So what you're going to want to do is take your time, go through that as much as possible. And then when you're done reading, you can come here to slide 20 and they'll try to explain some of the stuff to you. We know that this is a really old type of writing, so it's hard to understand. So we're going to go through the sections in this lesson and describe different parts of it to make sure you're following along. And that's the last couple slides of this lesson. But the history of it is important so you can actually have like a sense of what you're reading so it doesn't feel like you're reading this for no reason. This is one of the oldest surviving epics. So it's a really big thing in terms of English history and writing and stuff like that. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. That's it for today. We went a little over time, but I'm glad that we were able to get through as much as we needed to. If you're having any trouble actually reading Beowulf or understanding, even with the plot analysis that they give you at the end of that tutorial, please reach out to the English department. Our email is english@atsedu.net. And you can also ask your mentor to put you in contact with me. My name is Miss Amber, or Miss Kathy Vahovic, who is the other English tutor. Other than that, you should be able to get through it with smooth sailing. I've been looking at you guys' grades, and most of you seem like you've gotten through it without too big of a problem. But if there are any, of course, let everybody know. And this is Miss Amber signing off. Good luck with your English class.